If you want to speak intelligently about art among the kinds of people who like to speak intelligently about art today, you would do well to avoid mentioning the merits of beauty in evaluating any kind of art. Because after all, everybody knows that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that true art is defined by self-expression rather than the communication of beauty. But the problem with this view is that every single thing a person does is a revelation of themselves, i.e., self-expression. Every blunder or failure, every triumph, every outfit that they wear, every unintended nap that they take, every phrase that they utter, whether it's out of ignorance or wisdom, every task completed or uncompleted, is a form of self-expression. It expresses something about their character, their intelligence, their creativity, their passion or their lack of passions. If art is about self-expression and everything we do is an expression of self, then everything is art. And also, nothing is art. And it's worth asking, then, how did we get to this point in which art has become so diluted and so devalued in the minds of those professing to be its stewards and its curators? And the answer is, at least I believe, because art and culture are downstream from philosophy and creed. As Peter Kraft once, somewhere I think, said in a quote that I can't actually find now, so I'll just paraphrase it, was something like, you can't divorce artistic movements from their underlying philosophies. For example, Romanticism in art is inspired by Romanticism in philosophy. Art movements are the cultural embodiment of their creeds. So what are the underlying philosophies that dominate the contemporary artistic world? They are modernism and postmodernism, both of which fundamentally reject and deny any notion of objective beauty. Traditionally, countless generations of Western civilization believed that beauty was a transcendental, a property of being itself, which is the source of all other beings. Or another way to say it is, God is beauty. And because they revered beauty in this profound way, they gave us countless artistic treasures that people of all places and all times can admire. To say that we define what beauty is, as the phrase beauty is in the eye of the beholder does, is to say that we define what God is. God didn't make man, man made God, which for a Christian should be considered blasphemous to even think. And considering beauty itself is held in such contempt by the art establishment, it should be no surprise that what passes for art today is the furthest thing from beautiful. Take, for example, the Dada movement, or Dadaism, which was a modernist movement characterized by a wholesale rejection and simultaneously ridicule of traditional standards of art and beauty, which also had a strong affinity for extreme leftist and atheistic political philosophies. And you'd think that knowing this would be a helpful guideline for the church's own sacred use of art as like a clearly defined boundary to avoid. If a particular art movement rejects subjective beauty, which is essential to Christian metaphysics, then you would think it would be obvious to church leaders that any art inspired by such a misguided philosophy would be utterly incompatible with our sacred use. But sadly, this somehow hasn't been obvious to our leaders. Over the past half century at least, especially where I live, church architecture, church music, and other forms of sacred art seem to be dominated by modernism and postmodernism, or at best, a kind of awkward synthesis of traditional forms and these modern movements, a kind of like unequally yoked marriage that is therefore doomed to divorce. And what's worse, this isn't something that every pastor or every bishop needs to evaluate on a case-by-case basis and then discern and solve like a riddle, because the church has explicitly given us instructions on this very question. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the Catholic Church's constitution on sacred liturgy, the Council Fathers wrote this about sacred art. These arts, by their very nature, are oriented toward the infinite beauty of God, which they attempt in some way to portray by the work of human hands. And then it goes on to say, The church has, with good reason, always reserved to herself the right to pass judgment upon the arts, deciding which of the works of artists are in accordance with faith, piety, and cherished traditional laws, and therefore fitted for sacred use. When I read that, I think that there are at least three takeaways from those passages that I want to highlight. One, beauty exists outside of our own minds, and true sacred art is oriented towards that infinite divine beauty. Second, art can be judged, especially by the church, against an objective standard of merit. And lastly, since some art is in accord with those judgments, that also means that other forms are not in accord and not compatible with the standards that the church uses. So what then are those standards? Is it just based on the whim of a church leader's preference? Definitely not, and thank God. The magisterium has given us the criteria by which we can judge art that is appropriate and art that is not appropriate for sacred use. And they are holiness, beauty, and universality. By holiness, we mean that something about the art form should distinguish it from profane or secular purposes of art. This isn't the kind of art that is meant to entertain us or to amuse us. It's meant to draw our hearts and our minds to higher things. To be holy means to be set apart and distinct from the concerns of the world. Like artistic forms that are conceived of for their commercial potential are incompatible with sacredness for this reason. That's why rock and pop music are not good shells for sacred music. They were designed for like industrial scale consumer consumption, and they don't even pretend otherwise. They call themselves the music industry, as if art can be just mass-produced according to the methods of assembly line production meant to maximize profits. By beauty, we mean exactly that. It should be beautiful in form. And as Sacrosanctum Concilium instructs, it should be oriented towards and meant to portray the ultimate beauty of God. Art meant to shock, to ridicule, to satirize, or merely portray the ego or the self-expression of the artist is the opposite of works meant to communicate beauty. And remember, modernist art, in principle, rejects that such a thing is even possible. And lastly, universal, because it shouldn't be restricted to the particulars of any fashion, time, place, or acquired taste. It should be the kind of art that people of any place and any time can look at and appreciate. This is the reason why people will travel from around the world to stare at Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. It's the reason people of all walks of life can sit and listen to Gregorian chant or sacred polyphony and be moved by its serenity and beauty, or at the very least, its artistic merit. It's why once the novelty of all modern art and design pieces wears off on us, nobody would take any enduring interest in them, because aside from the shock of novelty, they have no universal or enduring appeal. They, especially in movements like Dadaism, are meant to mock both the viewer and the entire enterprise. And people are tired of being mocked by their superiors, at least I am. The classical and medieval world had more manners than that. They aimed to please and to edify onlookers. The modern world can only ridicule, which is why the embodiment of its nihilistic philosophy should never be used to profane the splendor and the sacredness of the prayers of the people of God. Can I indulge your patience for a second and ask for some help with my channel? I don't do this kind of work full-time, that is like YouTube production. I do try to hold down a full-time job, or actually two in my case, to keep this whole thing going, and that means a sacrifice of time and therefore income to make all of this possible. Now, compared to the number of viewers that I get on a weekly basis, a very small fraction of them are offering their support to keep this whole thing going. And in fact, a few have offered to make even bigger sacrifices, but I would much rather that the many contribute small amounts than a few making large amount contributions. And honestly, if the 10 to 20,000 people who watch my videos on a weekly basis and who apparently get some value out of them just like once a year drop $5 into the tip jar, then we'd be covered in our expenses for the year and we'd be all set. And I'm counting on the assumption that a once a year $5 contribution or sacrifice is realistic for most people. So if that's persuasive and you do want to help out, there's a couple ways that you can make a contribution. You can go to my website by visiting brianholdsworth.ca/support, or you can join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and opportunities to interact with me, as well as other like-minded members of the community, by visiting brianholdsworth.locals.com, and both links will be available in the description.